Hello and welcome to another Cultist Astronaut video. Today we're going to be building a new system out for basically entity organization. And I've been doing a lot of the legwork behind the scenes for this, so let's kind of just go through that and see like what we have. So it's not visible in the editor because we want to be able to see everything when we're making the game. But all of these entities are organized by room, or technically in the code they're called blocks. And the reason why we don't call them rooms in the code is because blocks can be used by more than just rooms. There is an association between a room and a block, but it's just through IDs. So the rooms have IDs, and then we use those IDs for storing them into blocks. And the reason we're taking a block structure with this in memory is so that we can efficiently switch between rooms. So there's many ways we could do this, but the way we're doing it here is we load the entire level and we take all the entities and we sort them into blocks or buckets or whatever you want to call them. And basically a block is just a list or an array of entities. And if we want to move an entity from one block to another, we basically copy it over to the new block and we remove it from the previous, right? And the blocks themselves, they're not composed of pointers or references. It's the actual memory for the entities, which is why we do a copy. And we want to move it from one block to another. And we don't really move things from one block to another very often. Right now, for example, the only thing that moves from room to room is the player. But in the future, we could move enemies from one room to another, and we would essentially use the same function call to do that. What this does is this allows us to cut down tremendously on the things we're querying against. For example, when the player is walking through the world, there are enemies like this king or the assortment of enemies you see down here who are searching to see if they can see the player. They want to find the player so they can attack it. And we have this, like before, we were searching through all the entities in the level. And you can imagine if there's hundreds of entities or even 1,000 entities, that's a lot of searching. Instead, what we do is we only search for the entities that are in the same block. So this skull right here, he's only searching for entities that are within this room, which eliminates all the entities from this room, from the previous room, and from this one. And of course, as we add more entities to the game, it will also eliminate the rest of those. So it's a way of us making those functions faster. And we're going to actually do the same thing for the raycast. The raycast right now is raycasting against all the static collision across the entire level. When in reality, all we need to do is raycast against the things in this level when this character is searching for a wall. We only need to check if we're hitting the walls in this room. So it's a way of spatially dividing the level. There are more dynamic ways of doing this. For example, I could use an octree. I guess in 2D it would be a quad tree. And I could dynamically chop the world up. But there are benefits to doing this in a static fashion, right? Like if I click on the entity here, you'll see that the block ID is 86. And all these entities share the same block ID. This means that the computer doesn't need to calculate this every frame. The downside to this is you can't dynamically move an entity from one room to another, right? Like this right here, he's still part of 86. He's not a part of this new block. And so we need to design a UI for the editor that allows us to migrate things over, right? And we do have this world browser, and it does have the ability to look at the various rooms and their tile maps, but we have no way of viewing the entities. And so we're going to implement a semi hierarchy. It's not going to be a true hierarchy like you see in other game engines or in a modeling program, but it is going to be a hierarchy that allows us to view the entities per block and in the root world. And when I say it's a semi-hierarchy, what I mean by that is we're not going to be able to modify sub-objects of entities, right? If you want to modify an entity, you have to go in and edit the asset. And we already have the code for that. So I can edit any of these assets, which are just entities, and then they update, right? So we take a slightly different workflow from something like Unity, which allows you to modify like every little aspect of a game object in the scene, and we break that concept up into, you have the world editor and you have the entity editor, and you can't modify an entity in the world. You have to modify it in the asset, and there's actually a lot of benefits to that, and it works great for our game and for our workflow. So we're going to keep that. But we do want to be able to see what entities we've placed in the world. And we can kind of do this already if we go to the actual world file. So this is the Xgorio world. This is the data that we've loaded in that allows us to see this. And you can see it defines where the player is, how many rooms we have, and it gives us all the room data. Right now, a room is very simple. It has an ID and it has an asset. But in the future, we're going to be moving more stuff into this. So for example, if I want to find asset 166, we go to the asset index. We search for ID 166. And you can see this is the platforming then combat.room, which is actually a file we can search for. And I can't display it in this editor because it has binary data. So let's just open that up in a separate program. And you can see it has all this data for the tile maps and their names. We might be moving some of this stuff out into its own separate file. Like you can see here, this is all the binary data that you need to load a tile map. And I'm thinking I want to separate that out so I can actually view, textual information. But things like position, this right here should actually be inside of the world, because maybe I want to spawn the same exact room in a different world, but I want it to be at a different position, right? So this will give us the ability to like instance the rooms. Anyway, everything you see here after the rooms is the entities, and basically we need a way to view this. And you can see it has an associated room. I might call this block ID, but you can see what entities are associated with like room 90, room 86. And for the most part, they're actually sorted just because of how we store the blocks in memory. So when I write this file out, we actually iterate over the blocks. And so naturally, we just get this like nice organization. Now we do reserve ID 0. So ID 0 is typically null. But for rooms, or for blocks, I should say, we do have an ID 0, which is the default block for the world. So why is this important? Well, if I make a new world, and I don't have a room, that means I don't have a block. And I create a saw blade, for example, you can see it appears. And it appears in block 0, which you can think of as like the root of the world. And so in the future, when we show the hierarchy, we'll have the root block, and then we have all of our rooms. And it's important that we show that so that the designer knows, oh, I need to move this from block 0 to the room, right? Another thing we can do to make this a little easier for the designer is, and this is just my initial idea, but you can see we have this bounding box that turns green when I mouse over it. And let's say I create a saw blade here. Well, you can see it puts it into block 0, but it could put it into block 90. Why? Because the object appeared on top. Now, this won't work if I do something like this, right? It's still in block 0. Maybe if the user drags it into a block radius, it changes it. So that's one idea. This won't work very well, though, if we have overlapping bounds. Like you see here, these rooms overlap. So that's something to think about. Like, the reason why I'm hesitant to do that is because of something like this. Another option is we do something similar to the entity editor, where like you have to click edit asset, and then you edit the the king. Except we do that for the room. So we can click on the room here, we can click edit, and it opens up this room editor, right? Maybe then we can then start placing the characters into here, and we can probably improve this UI too. I'm thinking instead of it being like an entity instance viewer, this could just be like a pretty default window that allows us to inspect the current room. And yeah, things get kind of crazy because we have like edit tile map, and now we have like these 3 windows open. So maybe there's some stuff we can do here to improve this workflow. But yeah, the first thing I want to do is get this working as a hierarchy. where we can see all the entities in block 0 and then in these subcategories. I'm thinking we take the tile maps and we put them into their own drop down, maybe tab it over so we can actually see it. And then we just list out the entities, and then I want these to be selectable. So an example of that would be, let me see if I can show that. Would that be in, let me go to the spine viewer. So the spine viewer actually uses a selectable list, and you can see when I select an object, it actually shows the circle moving. So I can see where all the bones are in this character. So we could do something similar where if I select the entity, it actually highlights it, and perhaps it like snaps it to the view. Maybe we make that a separate key press so that it's not annoying in how it like jumps around if you're just like trying to move things. So yeah, I'm going to get the basics working, and then we'll take a look at that in a moment. Okay, so I've added a new drop down to the world browser where it lets us see the entities. Currently, it only shows us the entities that are in block 0 or in the root. So I can create new entities and they'll populate into the list. And our code for selecting entities, anytime you create a new entity, it actually automatically selects it. And that's reflected here. So you can see I can switch between them and it will select the other entity in the list. And this kind of just works nicely with the existing controls. So we've always had this control where you could just click delete, and delete just deletes the selected entity, right? So I can like select these now and just remove them, which is super useful. So yeah, I can add other entities too. So this works for everything. They all show up. Now, what we want to do is we want to expand this so that we can actually use it for the rooms. So we're going to do some cleanup here, of course. We don't want it to be structured exactly like this, but we do want to be able to see the entities per room, and that's the next thing that I'll be working on. So if I go to Excoriya, currently we can't view the entities in this scene because they're not part of the root, they're part of the room. So I will work on that next. Alright, so we now have this converted over to a proper tree graph. So if we load up Excoriya, you'll see that every room is its own node. And using this node system, we're allowed to group other UI underneath it. So we still have the edit button and the enable room button. And then we can group things by type. So we have the tile maps. And of course, we have the entities. This room doesn't have any entities, so we can look at a different room like the king lair, which is where we're located. And this has a total of 3 entities, so we should be able to see that here. And then, of course, I'm able to actually select those objects. So that's working pretty good. We can go to something like the hangar intro, which has way more entities. And you can see here we have like a rusty door, some cutter cops, flying skeletons. And of course I can click on those and select it. So this is working pretty good. I think there's a couple things I would like to do. So for example, it would be cool to be able to click on something like the checkpoint here and then have it show up on the side here. So like it automatically opens up this section, which would be the Death Mountain entities, I think. Oh, not Death Mountain, it would be the Ruined Tower, I believe. This one. And then that just eliminates the need for me to have to, search through this hierarchy to find this spot. Like maybe I want to move this object from this spot in the world browser to a different spot. And if we want to, we can always make this larger. I should probably fix this gizmo overlap. And then I should be able to click and drag this up here. I'm going to have to look into Dear IamGUI's API for drag and drop, but I'm sure we can get that working. But yeah, that's much better than before, and we can expand this further if we like with more nodes, more nested nodes. Although I do like the simplicity of this being more flat and basically categorized. So yeah, I'm going to continue working on this, and I'll be back in a moment. Okay, so now we have the ability to move entities from one block or one room to another. So we'll take a look at that. We'll also take a look at the code. But first, let's just show an example of how this functions. So let's say that I want to create a new saw blade. And I want to put it into this room. I haven't implemented the code that would automatically place it in this room based on like where it spawns in. So you can see here it says that block ID is 0, which means that it's in the root. And so you can see it's right here. And if I add another saw blade, you'll see it appears in the same block. If I want to move this saw blade from this block to the room, I have to drag it into the king, or into the king layer, which is the room that the player's in right now. And IamGui makes this very easy. I can set this as a drag source, so it allows me to pick it up like this, and you can see it creates a preview, and I can actually set this preview to whatever I want. I can do an image, I could do whatever. It's pretty cool actually. What I'm doing is I'm just using the name of the entity, and then you can see I can actually mouse over any of these rooms and then release. And what it does when I click and drag, it creates a payload just being some data that tells me what entity it is that I'm selecting and where it's located. And then when I drop, it detects that, it accepts that payload, and then I can use that payload to move the entity over. So you can see these two saw blades are now a part of this room. And not only can I move it between, it just crashed because I haven't accounted for empty blocks yet, so I'm going to fix that next. But not only can I move it from room to room, I can move it, I can actually drag it into that entities dropdown, which is pretty nice. So you can drag it to multiple targets. And the way this works is pretty simple. We have this entity payload identifier. I'm just using a define to insert that quickly. In fact, I should be using it here, so let's do that real quick. And basically, I can begin a drag drop source. And so let's say I want to make something drag and drop, I would call this function right after that IamGui element. And so as you can see down here, let's see, there's a lot of code here. As you can see right here, for the, that's not it either. One moment. Oh, it's a separate function. Oops. Yeah, right here. So here's the tree node for the entity block. So the tree node is basically that entities group that we see at the top and inside of each room. And basically, we can accept the drag drop for the entity, and we can also begin a drag drop. So right here is where we do the selectable. This is the actual entity that you click on. And we call begin drag drop right afterwards so that it's linked to this selectable. And so now when I click on a selectable that has an entity, I can begin this drag drop for entity, which basically the payload that we pass in is just the handle. And the handle is really simple, right? The handle tells us which entity it is in the world, which block it belongs to, the index within the block, which is a little different than ID, right? ID is kind of like this static universal ID that we can use between entities within the world. Index is where it's located in memory. And then we also have the generation, which is how we check to see if the entity is still the same entity. For example, if I delete an entity and then I create another entity that takes that same slot or that same index, and let's say there's a character that's following another character and that character that it's following is deleted, well, generation lets me check to see if I'm still following the same thing or not. And this reduces bugs, right? I don't want to like have that guy vanish and then be replaced by a bullet. and then now the character is trying to follow the bullet because it's gone, right? And this is just a way for us to optimize memory. And so we add this generation so we can have a very clear way of checking. But this is all we're passing when we do a drag and drop, right? So you can see here we set the drag drop payload, and then here's the display. And so this display is what you see when you're dragging it. And then we have the accept drag drop, which we call before, right? I believe it's before. No, it's after. So for example, when I do the tree node for the entity block, this is that entity's label. We then call accept drag drop for entity. So this sets entities as a drop target, which is how I was able to drag it into the entities and also into the room. And for the room, we do the same thing. So down here, you'll see we have the tree node for the room, and then we accept the drag drop for that tree node. And what that does is it extracts the payload. So first it checks to see if there is a payload for entity, and if there is, we extract the data by doing some simple casting, because the payload actually contains a void pointer. So if we go to IamGUI, you can see here that the payload, IamGUI payload, has a void pointer. So we can actually extract that and then use it to determine how to transfer the entity. So I have a function that lets me move an entity to another block. And then of course, since we're transferring it, we have to remove the previous one, because transferring involves copying. And we actually do that already inside of the entity function. So if we go to entity storage, or I believe it's actually entities, and we go to the transfer to entity block, you'll see that we do mark it for deletion, but mark for deletion only runs during the game. In Unity, they have something similar. They have destroy and destroy immediate. This is destroy versus this is destroy immediate. So we mark it for deletion, but we also have to just remove it because we are in the editor. We're not actually running the game. So yeah, that is what we've done so far for drag and drop. It's working pretty good, as you can tell. I do have to fix up a couple null exceptions that we saw that caused it to crash, but that's super easy. Now I just want to do some quality of life stuff. So when I drag and drop it, it should still be selected, right? We don't have that functionality. I would like to be able to click on an entity in the scene and have it snap to it in the hierarchy. So I'm going to work on some quality of life things like this, and then we'll see where that lands us. All right, so I fixed the null reference crash and also got some quality of life features implemented into the hierarchy. So one thing that's really nice that we have now is I can click on an entity and it will auto expand the block or room that entity is contained in, and it also auto expands this entity's drop down. And the same is true for anything. So I can come down here, click on the saw blade, and you can see it takes me to the hangar intro room and then automatically selects this entity. Another nice thing I can do is I can double click on an entity in the list. So if I click on it once, it just selects it. At least it should. Looks like that's a bug. I'll fix that. But if you double click it, it will jump to the entity that you've selected. It's kind of strange that single click doesn't work. But we do have double click, and that does snap the camera to that entity, which is very useful if you're trying to navigate the scene and move things around. So if I wanted to, for example, move the player, I could snap to him. I can move him into the position that I want. And then I can move him to this room. Now he's part of the king room. And if I hit play, I start off in this room and you can see it says Flayed King. So that's all working pretty good. Of course, I can move him back and all of that. So I don't have any Control Z functionality yet, so that's something to work on. So right now I have to move him manually, but you can see he's back in there. And the Flayed King boss bar is gone because now I'm in a different room. I have noticed that I get a little bit of a frame hiccup when running OBS, so I need to see if there's some way I can improve that, because this runs really smooth when I'm not playing OBS, and it's not a very intensive game, at least not yet, and so it should be running just fine. So those are the two like quality of life things I've added. Another thing that I've added is if you click edit on a room, so like let's say I want to add more things to this room here. Well, right now if I add a saw blade, you can see it puts it into block 0, which means that it's in here. And that's not very good. And I think if I create a new one, it should automatically... No, it does not. I need to add that as well. I want it to like auto-select it when it gets added. But yeah, you can see these are in the root, and that's a problem because if I hit play, they're not here. That's because they're not part of the same, memory block as, this room. Which means that I have to select them and move them into the hangers. And that was the wrong hanger. I need to move them to the landing dock. And now you can see these saw blades are here. But what you can do instead, and this is kind of a workaround. Oh, and that's not, oh, the selection is broken. I need to fix that. What you can do as a workaround is you can click edit. And what this does is this selects this room and allows you to move it around. This background here is part of this room, which is why it doesn't move with it. It only moves the room. There's probably some improvements I can do to make everything move with it, so that's something to think about. But now if I create a saw blade, you can see it puts it into block 89, and if I hit play, it's here. The only problem with this is if I don't close the room editor, you can snap the saw blade to the corner. And that's because there's like the gizmos are fighting each other. And again, I want to improve this. I don't think this should be a separate widget. I think this should be like some kind of like object inspector, or like at least the active context or whatever. So if I'm editing a room, then this shows this. I can like click on the room or click edit, and then that kind of changes this view. And then if I select an entity, it changes this view. And then this would reduce the amount of windows I have. The same thing can be said for the tile map, which is its own separate tool. But if I close the editor, I can then move the saw blade freely, and the game or the editor remembers the last thing that I've modified, so I can keep adding saw blades to this. And if I want to switch to a different room, I can click edit, close that, and then I can create saw blades in here. And you can see it's part of 86. However, I was talking about just making it so that if I create an entity within the bounds, it would add it. But I did run into an issue with this overlap. In fact, all of these entities that you see here, I did like an auto conversion where I would check to see if they were within the bounds, and if they were, I would like transfer them, because before all of these objects existed in the root, they weren't sorted by their room. And it turned out that all of these entities beyond this line were actually part of this bounds. So I had to go through and drag these entities to the correct zone. And I want to avoid those subtle mistakes and just make it so that you have to like opt into that. In the future, as I'm refactoring how this room editor works, this will become much easier. But for now, this is a workaround. But yeah, in general, I'm really happy with this. We've improved performance. It's hard to tell because, like I said, OBS seems to be causing this number to freak out a little bit. So it's like jumping between like 5 milliseconds and what looks like sometimes 20 or even 50. I can't really tell. So I'm going to have to make like a profiler chart where I can see over time what this number looks like. And then I need to like zero in on the function that may be causing that. And I think it is the present function, which shouldn't be that complicated. The present function seems to be very sporadic when I'm using OBS. And so I'm guessing it's a DirectX 11 issue with video capture. So I'm going to have to take a look at that. But it could very well be something that I'm doing. But yeah, that's all I'm going to do for this video. There's obviously more I can do to improve this. Like I can have multi-select. I can't really multi-select things right now. But yeah, we've optimized the game. We moved things over to blocks. And then we created an editor that allows us to modify those blocks and view them. And yeah, generally I think this was a step in the right direction. If you have any questions or feedback, feel free to leave a comment below. And yeah, have a wonderful day. See you in the next video.